Isabella never thought she would be the kind of person to cut off her family. She had always believed that family came first, that you did whatever it took to take care of the people who raised you. For 6 years, she had been the one holding everything together, paying the rent for her parents' apartment, covering their bills, and even sending extra money for her younger brother, Lucas, so he wouldn't have to stress about tuition. She told herself it was temporary, that eventually, they would get back on their feet. But deep down, she knew the truth. They had no intention of standing on their own. As long as she kept paying, they would keep taking. She ignored that truth until the night everything changed. It was supposed to be simple, just one night. Tomorrow was the biggest presentation of her career, a pitch that could land her a long-awaited promotion. She had asked her parents for one favor, to watch Alice, her 6-year-old daughter, so she could focus. When she arrived at their apartment, overnight bag in hand, her mother, Vera, barely looked at her before crossing her arms. "What's this?" she asked, her tone already laced with disapproval. Isabella frowned, shifting Alice's bag in her hands. "Her things for tonight. You remember, right? My big presentation tomorrow?" She tried to keep her tone light, but something about the way her mother was staring at her sent a chill down her spine. Vera let out a sigh, shaking her head. "Isabella, we're not babysitters. We already raised our kids." The words were blunt, dismissive, as if she were asking for a luxury instead of a simple favor. Isabella's stomach twisted. Before she could respond, laughter echoed from the living room. She stepped past her mother, heart pounding. There, sprawled across the couch, was Lucas, beer in hand, while his girlfriend lazily scrolled through her phone. Their mother was watching Lucas's kids. Isabella froze. Her gaze darted between her mother and the scene unfolding before her. Lucas's twin boys were playing on the floor, their laughter filling the small apartment. Her father sat beside them, absent-mindedly helping them stack colorful blocks. Meanwhile, Lucas looked as if he didn't have a single worry in the world, completely at ease while his children were being taken care of. The unfairness of it all hit her like a punch to the stomach. She turned to her mother, her voice strained. "So, let me get this straight. You have time to watch Lucas's kids, but not mine?" Her mother's face barely shifted. If anything, there was a flicker of irritation, like she was tired of the conversation already. "It's different," she said flatly. "Lucas needs help. He's in school, he's working hard to build a future. You don't understand what it's like to struggle like that." The word stung, more than Isabella wanted to admit. She felt her breath hitch. "I don't understand struggle," she echoed, her voice rising despite herself. "I've been paying for everything, your rent, your bills, his tuition, while raising a child and working a full-time job. But I don't understand struggle." Lucas finally looked up from his phone, scoffing. "Oh, come on, Isa. You act like we forced you. You offered." Isabella's hands clenched into fists. Offered? Was that what they called it now? The late-night calls about emergencies that always seemed to coincide with credit card due dates? The guilt-tripping messages about how Lucas was the hope of the family and she had the privilege of helping? The quiet expectation that she would always step in because she was the responsible one? She swallowed hard, trying to keep her voice steady. "I offered because you made me believe I had no choice." Her mother sighed dramatically, rubbing her temples like she was the victim here. "Isabella, we don't have time for one of your meltdowns. If you can't handle everything, maybe you should rethink your priorities. A good daughter doesn't throw her family's sacrifices back in their faces." The words cut deep, but this time, something inside Isabella snapped. She looked around the room, at her father, who still wouldn't meet her eyes, at Lucas, who had already gone back to his phone, at her mother, who acted like her exhaustion was an inconvenience. It was like she was seeing everything clearly for the first time. They didn't love her. Not really. They loved what she could do for them. And the moment she stopped giving, she would become nothing to them. The realization hit so hard she almost laughed. Instead, she exhaled sharply and reached for Alice's bag. "You know what? Don't worry about it." Her mother's lips pressed together. "Isabella, don't be dramatic." But Isabella was already turning toward the door, gripping her daughter's hand. "No, really. I wouldn't want to inconvenience you." The drive home was silent. Alice, sensing the tension, clutched her stuffed bunny and leaned against the window. Isabella kept both hands on the wheel, gripping it so tightly her knuckles ached. Her mother's words replayed in her head like a broken record. A good daughter doesn't throw her family's sacrifices back in their faces. But what sacrifices? Who had sacrificed for who? For 6 years, she had stretched herself thin to keep them comfortable. And the one time, she needed something in return, they turned their backs on her without hesitation. The unfairness of it burned through her veins, but beneath the anger was something heavier. A hollow, sinking realization. They never saw me as family. Just a wallet with a pulse. When she got home, she barely had the energy to undress before collapsing onto the couch. Gabriel, her husband, emerged from the bedroom, already knowing from one look at her face that something was wrong. "Did they say no?" he asked quietly. She let out a bitter laugh. "Not just no. They acted like I was crazy for even asking." Gabriel exhaled, rubbing the back of his neck. "You know what I'm gonna say." Isabella shut her eyes. She did. He had been saying it for years. Stop paying for them. Stop letting them drain you dry. But she had always found excuses. They needed her. They didn't have anyone else. They weren't bad people. But tonight had made something painfully clear: they weren't struggling. They were comfortable. Because she was the one struggling for them. Isabella stared at the ceiling, her mind racing. For years, she had convinced herself that cutting them off would be cruel, selfish. But was it? Was it really selfish to stop being used? She pulled out her phone, opened her banking app, and scrolled through the endless list of payments she had been making for them. Rent, utilities, phone bills, Lucas's tuition, random emergencies that never seemed to stop. Her stomach twisted when she added it all up. Over 6 figures. Money that could have gone toward Alice's future. Money that could have allowed her to breathe, to save, to actually enjoy the life she worked so hard for. Her hands trembled as she hovered over the "Cancel Automatic Payment" button. Gabriel sat beside her, his voice calm but firm. "You don't have to do this tonight," he said. She swallowed hard. "If I don't do it now, I never will." And she meant it. She had spent years pushing this decision away, clinging to the idea that maybe one day they would change. That they would finally appreciate her. But tonight had proven what she had been too scared to admit: they would never stop taking unless she stopped giving. With a deep breath, she clicked the button. One by one, the transactions disappeared. The rent. The utilities. The tuition. The emergency fund. She felt something uncoil in her chest, something heavy she hadn't even realized she had been carrying. When the last payment was gone, she exhaled and set the phone down. For the first time in 6 years, she was free. The next morning, the storm began. Isabella had barely finished her coffee when the calls started, first her mother, then her father, then Lucas. She didn't answer. She knew exactly what they wanted. They had just realized the money was gone. By noon, her phone was flooded with messages, each one more desperate than the last. "Mom, Isabella, there must be a mistake. The rent didn't go through. Dad, call me back. Now. Lucas, WTF, did you forget about my tuition payment?" She stared at the screen, a strange sense of detachment washing over her. For years, she had lived in fear of disappointing them, of being seen as ungrateful. But now? Now, she felt nothing. She set her phone aside, focusing on the final touches of her presentation. But by evening, the messages had changed. "Mom, I don't know what kind of game you're playing, but we could be evicted." "Dad, this is how you treat family after everything we did for you?" "Lucas, you're really gonna screw us over just because you're jealous?" Jealous. That word made her stomach turn. Lucas, who had never paid a single bill in his life, thought she was jealous of him? A man who lived off her money? Who had the luxury of never worrying about rent? Who got to enjoy life while she worked herself to exhaustion? She wanted to scream. Instead, she laughed. A cold, bitter laugh that held years of resentment. "They don't even realize what they've done. They just think I finally stopped being useful." By the next morning, her mother had taken things public. A long, emotional Facebook post, dripping with guilt and carefully crafted to make Isabella the villain. "Heartbroken today. Some children forget where they came from. After all the sacrifices we made, our own daughter has turned her back on us. Please pray for our family during this difficult time." The comments poured in almost instantly. "So sorry, Vera. You raised her better than this. Kids these days are so selfish. She'll regret this when she has no family left." And then, right beneath it, Lucas had left a comment: "She's always been like this, Mom. Some people only care about money." Isabella felt sick. It was so easy for them. So easy to rewrite history. To pretend she was some cold-hearted daughter who had abandoned her poor, struggling family. Not the woman who had spent 6 years funding their entire lives. The audacity of it made her hands shake. But nothing, not the calls, not the messages, not even the Facebook post, prepared her for what came next. That afternoon, her boss pulled her aside. He looked uncomfortable, almost apologetic. "Your parents showed up at the office," he said, lowering his voice. "Security had to escort them out." Isabella's breath caught in her throat. They went to her office? She could barely process the words. Her parents, her grown, capable, functioning adult parents, had stormed into her workplace like she was a rebellious teenager who needed to be scolded. They were making a scene, her boss continued, rubbing his temples. Talking about how you'd abandoned them, how they needed your help. Security had to intervene. His expression hardened. Isabella, I don't need to tell you how bad this looks. We're a professional environment. If this happens again, he didn't finish the sentence. He didn't have to. Shame burned through her. They had humiliated her. At work. In front of her colleagues. All because she dared to say no. That was the final straw. That night, after putting Alice to bed, she sat on the couch, phone in hand. Gabriel sat beside her, silent but supportive, as she typed one last message in the family group chat. From now on, take care of yourselves. Then, without waiting for a response, she blocked them all. Her parents. Lucas. Every flying monkey relative who had tried to guilt trip her. One by one, their numbers disappeared from her contacts. When it was done, she set the phone down and exhaled. The silence was deafening. But for the first time in her life, it felt like peace. At first, she expected the guilt to creep in. For years, she had been conditioned to feel responsible for them, to carry their burdens as if they were her own. But as the days passed, something surprising happened. She didn't feel guilty. She felt lighter. No more late-night phone calls about last-minute bills. No more stress about whether she could afford Alice's school tuition while still covering her parents' expenses. For the first time in 6 years, her money was hers. Her parents, however, didn't give up so easily. When the calls stopped working, they showed up at her apartment. She didn't open the door. When they left voicemails crying, she deleted them. When distant relatives tried to shame her into changing her mind, she blocked them too. And then, finally, the inevitable happened, they ran out of options. Lucas, who had never worked a day in his life, was forced to get a job. Her parents, unwilling to downsize for years because they knew she would always cover the rent, were finally forced to move into a smaller apartment. They were struggling. But that wasn't her problem anymore. Life moved on. Isabella poured her energy into her work, and just a few months later, it paid off. She got the promotion. A bigger salary, a better office, and most importantly, the peace of knowing she had earned it on her own. No one was draining her dry anymore. She and Gabriel moved into a larger home, one with a backyard where Alice could play freely. For the first time in years, she started saving, not for other people, but for her daughter's future. For her own future. One afternoon, while grocery shopping, she ran into an old family friend. The woman gave her a knowing look, lowering her voice like she was sharing some tragic secret. Your parents are struggling, you know, she said. Maybe you should forgive them. Isabella just smiled, placing a carton of milk into her shopping cart. They're adults. They'll figure it out. And for the first time, she truly believed it.